Correction.
They don't get to steal it from us. We want our country back.
Domestic terrorists encouraged by the president desecrate the Capitol.
Don't dare call them protesters. They were a riotous mob, insurrectionists, domestic terrorists.
What happened here today was an insurrection incited by the President of the United States.
What happened yesterday is textbook terrorism.
January 6th will go down as one of the darkest days in recent American history.
With 10 days left in his term, Trump banned from Twitter, growing calls to remove him from office.
If the Vice President and Cabinet do not act, the Congress may be prepared to move forward with impeachment.
I will definitely consider whatever articles they might move.
All the fallout this morning from the chaotic conclusion to the Trump presidency.
From ABC News, this is a special edition of This Week. Here now, Chief Anchor George Stephanopoulos.
Good morning and welcome to This Week. Before the first votes were cast, President Trump called it a rigged election, refused to promise a peaceful transfer of power if he lost. And from the moment he lost, Trump lied about the results, encouraging supporters to stop the steal. Those were the chants heard from his mob as they stormed the Capitol on Wednesday. The most serious attack on that citadel of our democracy since the British invasion of 1814. Except this time, the attackers were American citizens, incited by the president. 5 died from the assault, including a police officer defending the Capitol. The American carnage Trump decried in his inaugural address is defining his final days in office, with growing calls for an unprecedented second impeachment. Over 190 members of Congress have now sponsored an impeachment resolution that concludes Donald John Trump engaged in high crimes and misdemeanors by willfully inciting violence against the government of the United States. And our brand new poll with Ipsos shows a majority of Americans want the president removed from office before his term ends. We cover all the fallout this morning, starting with our team of correspondents. I want to go to Mary Bruce on Capitol Hill. And Mary, no president has been impeached twice. No president has been impeached in his final days. Of course, no president has been credibly accused of inciting an insurrection. So we're in completely uncharted territory here.
George, completely unprecedented. The Hill right now is barreling towards impeachment again. It is one final massive political test of the Trump presidency. So tomorrow, House Democrats plan to introduce an article to impeach the president for inciting violence. Democrats overwhelmingly support this, and we expect some Republicans could back this too. Now, the House Speaker has told her members to be prepared for action, but she has not yet formally backed impeachment proceedings. If she does, though, this could move very quickly, but not quickly enough to actually remove Trump from office early. A Senate trial is not expected to start until after Biden is inaugurated, and Republicans there are likely going to face tremendous pressure from both sides. 17 of them would have to join Democrats to convict. And while we have seen a growing number of Republicans criticizing the president, most are walking a very fine line on the question of culpability. So right now, just a few Senate Republicans have suggested they could possibly back impeachment. Democrats are also in a tough position, though. They want to hold Trump accountable, but they also want to unite and bring the country together. And a Senate trial would dominate the early days of the new administration, just as President Biden is eager to get to work, George.
And that is the concern, and that's why House Speaker Nancy Pelosi is keeping her cards very close. But she could delay the introduction, delay sending over the articles of impeachment, even if they pass them, until later in the term.
Absolutely. And of course, we saw that she did delay the first time the president was impeached. Now, that conviction just less than a year ago, as hard as that is to imagine. So there are options here. We do not know simply how this is going to play out. All we know is that there is growing frustration here on the Hill. Democrats know they have to do something. But where this ends and how it plays out still remains unclear right now.
Okay, Mary, thanks very much. Let's go to our chief White House correspondent, John Karl. John, the president hunkered down in the White House, pretty isolated right now. How are they, those remaining around him, preparing for possible impeachment?
Well, the legal team is preparing, George, but they will be proceeding without the 2 lawyers that led the president's defense during the last impeachment. Pat Cipollone, the White House counsel, has barely spoken to the president since the riot on Wednesday. I am told that he has considered resigning. He certainly won't be taking part in the defense. And then Jay Sekulow, who has been with the president since the beginning, I am told, has told colleagues that he has no intention of defending him this time. That means the legal team that would defend him now would be led likely by Rudy Giuliani and by Alan Dershowitz.
Meantime, Vice President Pence said yesterday he's going to go to the inauguration, another break from Trump, even though he is refusing to pursue the 25th Amendment option.
Yeah, and what's remarkable here, George, is since that moment when Mike Pence was rushed out of the Senate chamber, taken to a secure location under attack, some of those protesters actually chanting, "Hang Pence," truly his life in danger during this. The president has not spoken to him, didn't speak to him that day, and has not spoken to him since.
And what else we know about these final 10 days from the president's perspective? More pardons on the table. That question of a self-pardon still alive?
You know, the final days, the honest answer is who knows. There certainly will be more pardons. I'm told to expect a lot of them. I'm told that he almost certainly will include a pardon of himself. Also, if you can imagine this, George, the White House is planning a series of events to highlight the Trump legacy, kind of as if all this isn't going on. You know, talk about the border wall, he'll talk about his economic record, he'll talk about his record on the Middle East with different events every day. At least that's what they're planning for the final days.
Reminders of the famous Infrastructure Week. John Karl, thanks very much. Let's bring in our Chief Justice Correspondent, Pierre Thomas. Pierre, the latest on the investigations and arrests. We're seeing arrests all over the country right now.
George, a sweeping manhunt underway, and it's nationwide. Sources telling me overnight that the first and most urgent priority is to identify several groups of men who breached the Capitol, forcing their way in through windows, smashing through doors, attacking police using chemicals, baseball bats, and metal pipes. George, the FBI wants to know if the assault was pre-planned, a plot or several plots, potentially involving multiple actors. One theory is that 2 bombs were placed at the DNC and RNC headquarters to distract police and potentially reduce the number of law enforcement at the Capitol. The FBI is asking for the public's help to identify and locate this suspect, and there are reports that some of the members of the mob had radios. George, and take a look at this picture. Here's a man apparently wearing a ski mask, and you see a bunch of zip ties which can be used as handcuffs. Were some of these thugs planning to take members of Congress or the vice president hostage? The scary thing is many of those most violent offenders may have gotten away, George.
Except we know they caught one, a protester, a rioter, who appeared to pose a serious threat to House Speaker Nancy Pelosi.
Indeed. Great concern about her safety. And the second area of focus is to immediately apprehend the members of the mob who appear in some of the most infamous images. George, it's no coincidence that in the last 24 hours, the man who was in Nancy Pelosi's office, feet on her desk, arrested. The man who stole Speaker Pelosi's lectern, arrested. And this man seen wearing horns, face paint, carrying a spear with a metal tip, also charged. Authorities are trying to send a message that these people are not to be glorified, but they're going to jail. And expect a lot more charges to come, George.
And in the wake of the siege of the Capitol, new concerns about security at the inauguration.
Great worry about the coming days. Authorities are also expressing concern about state capitals across the nation. Officials are mindful that this inauguration must, and I emphasize must, have a level of security that exceeds the threat that might be out there. By the end of this weekend, there will be roughly 6,000 National Guard troops here in the nation's capital to help the thousands of police here. A lot of these far-right groups are very animated right now, very angry about the fatal shooting of the woman who illegally entered the Capitol. And some of these far-right groups, including white supremacists and a loosely knit association known as the Boogaloo, have been hoping for a race or civil war. The coming days intense for law enforcement officials. Coming up, George.
Thank you, Pierre. Let's bring in Martha Raddatz, our Chief Global Affairs Anchor, for more on this. Martha, 10 days left in the presidency. The president is isolated. He's acting erratically, under fire. This raises concerns about our vulnerability to national security threats.
Absolutely. The assault on the Capitol, imagine our adversaries looking at that. China, Russia, Iran, all know this is an incredibly vulnerable time for the United States. The Pentagon is watching this closely, watching everything. The biggest concern right now, George, is Iran. There have been great tensions with Iran over the last couple of months. The anniversary of the drone strike on Soleimani that killed him. They think that Iran is looking for revenge. We sent a carrier back into the Persian Gulf as a show of strength. They do not believe, authorities do not believe there is anything imminent with Iran, but they are watching the government closely. They are watching the surrogates closely. Just a month ago, there were 21 rockets launched in Iraq towards the U.S. embassy, and those, they believe, were by Iranian-backed militias, George. So this is a very vulnerable time.
No question about that. And Martha, on Friday, we saw that extraordinary call from House Speaker Nancy Pelosi to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, wanting to know what kind of safeguards were in place to prevent any kind of improper nuclear strike by the president.
I think there was surprise that that was made public. Again, adversaries are looking at us every minute, and China and Russia certainly were surprised that that was made public. But Nancy Pelosi was assured that there are procedures in place, guaranteed that there will not be any sort of accidental launch of a nuclear weapon or any sort of illegal launch of a nuclear weapon. There does not seem to be a lot of concern about that just because of those procedures. Many people think there are not enough procedures, and I'll bet you that's something they look at in the new administration. But for now, they are not concerned about that.
Okay, Martha, thanks very much. So many legal and constitutional questions in play right now, so let's bring in our legal team. Chief Analyst Dan Abrams, Kate Shaw, also Professor of Constitutional Law, Cardozo Law School. Dan, let me begin with you. If this happens, impeachment will be the fastest impeachment ever. And there are those concerns about it complicating President-elect Biden's agenda going forward. But a lot of Democrats also saying this is just a conduct that cannot be ignored.
Yeah, and it's not just the conduct that was leading up to the riot. When I say that, I mean not just the specific words that led to the riot. I think you're going to be talking about what happened before that as well, which is the constant lie about the election. Think about that. If this election had actually been stolen, if Donald Trump had actually won in a landslide, it would be awful and horrible and lead people to want to march on the Capitol. And yet it was all a lie. And so I think that's going to come into play when you're talking about impeachment, then the words about going to the Capitol, and then what actually happened during the event itself, the inaction. If it's true, for example, that there was a delay in calling the National Guard, we know there was a delay in asking, demanding that the rioters de-escalate. All of those are issues that, for example, might not be quite as relevant in a court, but certainly will be absolutely relevant in the context of impeachment.
Kate Shaw, could the founders have contemplated this?
You know, you're hard-pressed to look at anything in American history that comes close to a president inciting a violent mob to storm Congress, to thwart the counting of electoral votes, which is part of the peaceful transfer of power, you know, resulting in actual danger to members of Congress, the death of a police officer, threats to his own vice president. It's really difficult to find anything in American history that comes close to this. And in some ways, you know, that's what high crimes and misdemeanors mean anything. If the impeachment process is designed for anything, it is this kind of conduct, rather. And so I do think that there's a real question before members of Congress whether this president can be permitted to just finish the term, or some sort of more decisive repudiation is required. And obviously the second impeachment of a president ever, and potentially the first actual removal of a president ever. All of that would require, you know, speed that has never been seen before in impeachment. But as you say, George, I think that we are in, you know, uncharted and unprecedented kinds of waters.
And Dan, there's also going to be more pressure now on Joe Biden's Justice Department, led by Merrick Garland, if indeed he is confirmed, to look at possible prosecution of the president, especially if he tries a self-pardon.
Right. So we'll see if that happens. There's no definitive answer to the question of can a president self-pardon? But let's just take a look at what that would mean. If the president can self-pardon, that would mean he's immune from prosecution during the time of being president, and then immune from prosecution after he's president as well. That will only be challenged if they're going to go forward with some sort of federal charges. I think with regard to the Capitol event itself, it's probably unlikely. And that's because the Supreme Court has set the standard very high for what you have to demonstrate to be responsible, for example, for inciting an insurrection or inciting a riot. I'm not saying that someone couldn't make a case, but there has intentionally been an incredibly high standard with regard to specific calls for violence that might not cross that legal line. But remember, self-pardon, Federal charges, that has nothing to do with the state investigation in New York. Can't self-pardon against that. There could be additional investigations in Georgia, et cetera. All of that is stuff that the president can't and won't be immune from.
Kate Shaw, if the president could pardon himself, he's by definition above the law, isn't he?
Right, I think that's the fear, and I think that in some ways, if he attempts a self-pardon, and I think there's every reason to believe that he will, that in some ways makes it more likely that the Justice Department might actually try to make a federal case. I think Dan is right that these could be difficult cases to build, but the danger of not doing so, I think, would be setting a precedent whereby a president could engage in any kind of misconduct in office, pardon himself, and thereby escape any kind of legal responsibility. And I think DOJ might be really concerned about letting that kind of precedent stand. So a self-pardon might counterintuitively increase the chances that justice, and by the way, the Justice Department does not believe self-pardons are constitutionally permissible. At least the one public writing on the topic suggests as much. So I think he might be inviting those charges if he does attempt a self-pardon.
Kate Shaw, Dan Abrams, thanks very much. Let's take a deeper look now at big tech's moves against the president on social media with Kara Swisher. She's from the New York Times, host of the Sway podcast. Kara, thank you for joining us today. So the president's banned from Twitter, 88 million followers, banned from Facebook, 35 million followers. Parler appears to be getting shut down. What do you make of all this?
Well, you know, this has been going on for a long time. President Trump has been violating rules all over social media for a long time, but they gave him a pass because he was considered a newsworthy figure. And now, you know, then they started to label him, as you know, and that wasn't very effective. And he continued to press the game and game these social media companies. And then at this point, when he was part of incitement using their tools, they decided to shut him down finally. And of course, it comes at the end. This has been, you know, 4 years of this going on, and now at the end they finally realize how dangerous it is because of what happened at the Capitol. So what's happening here is social media took way too long to deal with this issue, and of course it resulted in what happened.
Now you're seeing the president's son and his supporters complaining about censorship and double standards. They say that Twitter and Facebook don't knock the Ayatollah off Twitter. They're also saying that the president's First Amendment rights are being violated.
They're not. They're not being violated. These are private companies. They are not public squares. And unfortunately, a lot of the people who are complaining, many of whom work in Congress, haven't really read the First Amendment, which says Congress shall make no law against abridging freedom of speech. It doesn't say that that Facebook or Twitter or Apple or anybody should make no law. They can do whatever they want. They're private businesses, very similar to a restaurant where someone comes in and rants and starts to threaten violence and things like that. They get kicked out. And so this is a private enterprise, and a lot of their arguments, I mean, I know I made a joke last night on Twitter about this. It sounds pretty socialist if they want to control private companies. Now, it's uncomfortable because these companies have become an important way for President Trump to communicate with people, and it's problematic for them. But it certainly isn't censorship. It's a business deciding they don't want to be involved having their tools facilitate domestic terrorism, and I think that's relatively reasonable and far too late in coming for these companies to have done anything about it. They're also culpable in how long it took them to do anything.
How about this argument from the ACLU? Quote, this is their senior legislative counsel, Kate Wayne. She says, we understand the desire to permanently suspend him now, but it should concern everyone when companies like Facebook and Twitter wield the unchecked power to remove people from platforms that become indispensable for the speech of billions. President Trump can turn to his press team or Fox News to communicate with the public, but others, like the many black, brown, and LGBTQ activists who've been censored by social media companies, will not have that luxury.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. We have to have a long debate about these sites because they begin so big, and there's not enough innovation or enough companies in this area, and that's about power, and that's about market power and things like that. But the fact of the matter is they are private companies. They are not the public square, and so we need maybe more private companies that are doing this. We need more diversity in the kinds of social media sites that we have. We now have one company, Facebook, which really controls quite a bit of social media, and then we have Twitter, and then we have the other companies who have other powers. And so that's a bigger debate that we need to have, and it is solved through innovation and the ability to have as many places where people can facilitate conversation. I think the issue, though, is that President Trump violated rules that were very specific, and he did it over and over again, and then moved over to really, which is the bright red line for a lot of these companies, which is incitement of violence. It's very clear from the get-go that these companies have said this. Now, they are capricious in how they enforce these things, and that's another issue, is that we've left a lot of this to private companies to capriciously decide which rules are which. But the fact of the matter is, they are private companies, and so to link it with the First Amendment is problematic. The second part is to try to change the narrative around what's happening here. They'd like to focus on that they've lost followers. Well, many people lost their lives this week, and so that's what's going on with a lot of the noise around censorship, is they don't want anybody to focus on the arrests and the problems and the violence that happened at the Capitol, as you're seeing through more videos. And so that's really the issue going forward, is we've got to have smart legislation around the power of tech companies, which I've called for years, but at the same time not react in this way that they've taken away, you know, all my toys, and that's unfair. It's just specious what they're doing right now.
Kara Swisher, thanks for your insight.
The person who's running the executive branch is a deranged, unhinged, dangerous president of the United States, and that only a number of days until we can be protected from him. But he has done something so serious that there should be prosecution against him.
I don't think anybody can look and say an impeachment of this president is the thing that's going to help unite and bring our country together.
The debate is joined over impeachment. Let's talk about it now with two members of Congress. Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, she's a Democrat from New York. Congressman Adam Kinzinger, Republican from Illinois. And Congresswoman Cortez, let me begin with you. So I know you're a supporter of impeachment. The Speaker has not yet decided whether she's going to schedule it. Should she schedule it, will it pass?
Well, you know, I absolutely believe that impeachment should be scheduled for several reasons. One, of course, our main priority is to ensure the removal of Donald Trump as president of the United States. Every minute and every hour that he is in office represents a clear and present danger, not just to the United States Congress, but frankly to the country. But in addition to removal, we're also talking about complete barring of the president, or rather of Donald Trump, from running for office ever again. And in addition to that, the potential ability to prevent pardoning himself from those charges that he was impeached for.
And, you know, the several Republican members of Congress who opposed raising objections to the certifying the Electoral College vote have written a letter to President-elect Biden opposing impeachment. Here's what the letter says. It says, in the spirit of healing and fidelity to our Constitution, we ask that you formally request that Speaker Nancy Pelosi discontinue her efforts to impeach President Donald J. Trump a second time. A second impeachment only days before President Trump will leave office is as unnecessary as it is inflammatory. They're saying, for the sake of unity, forego impeachment.
Well, you know, I think there's a couple of things. One is we have to understand that what happened on Wednesday was insurrection against the United States. That is what Donald J. Trump engaged in, and that is what those who stormed the Capitol engaged in. And so when we talk about healing, the process of healing is separate and, in fact, requires accountability. And so if we allow insurrection against the United States with impunity, with no accountability, we are inviting it to happen again. That is how serious it is. And I do not believe that perhaps my colleagues weren't in that room. Perhaps my colleagues were not fully present for the events on Wednesday, but we came close to half of the House nearly dying on Wednesday. And if a foreign head of state, if another head of state came in and ordered an attack on the United States Congress, would we say that that should not be prosecuted? Would we say that there should be absolutely no response to that? No. It is an act of insurrection. It's an act of hostility. And we must have accountability, because without it, it will happen again.
There's a concern also from Democrats, though, that if you're having a Senate trial, it can't happen in the next 10 days. If you're having the Senate trial in the early days of President Biden's term, it's going to prevent the confirmation of his appointees to the cabinet. It's going to slow down, perhaps, the passage of essential COVID relief legislation.
You know, I think, George, I think we need to review what actually happened on Wednesday. The National Guard was requested by the D.C. Council and was rejected. We are talking about and we are hearing about a complete and utter lack of preparation. The chief of the D.C. Capitol Police lied to House Administration Chairwoman Zoe Lofgren about the preparations of what happened. We need to know what happened and how deep this goes. And if we do not take corrective action right now, we are talking about those same potentially compromised elements being in charge of the president's security during the inauguration. And so, with profound respect, I believe that the president's safety and the safety of the United States Congress and the security of our country, it takes precedent over the timing of nominations and the timing of potential confirmations. This is in immediate danger right now.
So you're confident House Speaker Nancy Pelosi is going to move forward with impeachment?
I do believe that we will be moving forward with impeachment, but again, we are looking towards multiple avenues, and I do not believe that those avenues are mutually exclusive. This is not an either-or proposition. This is not either the 25th Amendment or impeachment or investigating our other avenues through the 14th Amendment. I do not believe that any of these avenues are competitive with one another. They all frankly provide their own form of relief and their own forms of accountability. And so I do not believe that this is a question of deciding or debating between which of these avenues we should pursue. I believe we should take an all of the above approach.
Congressman, thanks for your time this morning. Let's bring in Congressman Kinzinger as well. So, Congressman Kinzinger, you've been outspoken about the president's conduct. You've said that the 25th Amendment should be invoked. You've encouraged the vice president to lead that effort. Will you vote for an impeachment resolution?
Look, I'll vote the right way when whatever's put in front of me. There's a lot of still negotiation going on. I honestly don't think impeachment's the smart move because I think it victimizes Donald Trump again. And I think there's a moment that we're in right now where Donald Trump, he's looking really, bad. You just can't even put that into words, right? He stirred up a crowd. It was an executive branch attack on the legislative branch, one of the worst days in American history. So I'll vote the right way, if I'm presented with that. I just think it's probably not the smartest move right now, but I think that's going to be out of my hands.
So, but what about the argument that the Congressman was making? I assume that when you say you'd vote the right way is if you're presented with it, you do consider this an impeachable offense, you would vote for it, but it's not the preferred course. What are the alternatives when you're facing conduct like this by a president of the United States?
Well, I think it would be the right move if we had more than basically 10 days left of the administration, right? The fact that you had mentioned we're not going to be able to even get through a trial. So, yeah, he'll be impeached a second time, but also exonerated in theory a second time. Depends on how that trial goes. If they can do it when he's out of office, all that. I think there's a lot of ideas with censure, with preventing him from being able to run again. The reality is we just don't have a lot of time in this administration left, which right now is a good thing. I think what bothers me probably more than anything is I think as the dust settles, maybe it's settling in, I don't know. But what happened was unprecedented on January 6th, and hopefully nothing like that will ever happen again. But I think we were very close, as Ms. Ocasio-Cortez said just now. I think we were very close to actually having members of Congress killed. If you see the videos and you see, based that last line of defense between the floor of the House of Representatives where members were hunkered down and the young lady that came through the window, had that whole thing been breached, there would have been